Exhausted.
That's great. We're live. So that was a great. We're talking about A&M and LSU rivalries, as we tend to do on Bible study. But yeah, everybody, welcome. If you're joining now during 7 o'clock time, or if you're watching later, we'd love for you to comment and say hello and let us know. I don't know. Tonight it might be interesting. What are you doing while watching Bible study? Because David's sitting by a lake. So I know that everybody feels really bad for him.
It's really a tough job. Somebody's got to do it, though. If only there was like a pandemic and a church to run or something.
Ooh, big yikes. Big yikes. Anyways, yeah, so Jennifer, hello. Let me see. I have to go look. Poor David.
It feels bad for me.
It's my job to really drum up sympathy for you.
Well, you're doing a good job.
Is that what all associates do?
I mean, that's generally the idea. Is all associates are simply there to make the senior pastor look better. Keri Lynn's outshining me in multiple ways, however, so it's not working very well.
Never. Oh, man.
Congratulations to Keri Lynn today and Katrina on their day one of appointment number 1. Official. Today.
How does it feel?
Weird. Like, it felt not real and real, like, all at the same time, because it's not real, but it is real. Like, so I didn't baptize anybody or administer the sacrament of communion, so I don't really feel like I was an elder today.
That's the best thing. For probably a week leading up to my first service, I would tell my head pastor, I get to do communion. I get to do communion this week. It is the best feeling in the world, standing up there doing your first year.
Yeah, that's cool. So Katie, I'll go ahead and introduce you so people know who you are. But we have Katie Glass joining us. Katie was my soul sister, survival friend, seminary pal. When I had no hot water in my house, I showered at Katie's place before school. We watched the A&M LSU game together. We're both donning our respective teams tonight in total respect and admiration. Only a little bit of saltiness. But Katie is, we also got to travel to Israel together as part of our seminary journey. And so Katie got to really watch a very interesting transformation of one Keri Lynn to another Keri Lynn. And I think I got to see the same with you. So Katie was commissioned last year in the Louisiana annual conference. I tried so hard to keep her in North Texas, but her heart just lives in Louisiana. And she's now the associate pastor at, I have forgotten the church name now that we're live on the internet.
First Methodist Alexandria.
I should have just said First Methodist. That would have been fine. But she's been there for 2 years now, and she is just, Katie has a lot of fans, and everybody loves her, and I'm probably one of her biggest fans. So this is just almost like selfish goodness for me to get to have truly one of my best friends from seminary on tonight. So Katie, do you want to tell them anything about yourself that I've missed?
No, just that I'm probably as big a fan of Keri Lynn as she is of me. We were definitely, we sat by each other in class, almost every class we had together, because we knew that nobody else would tolerate sitting by us. And so
that's true. Yeah, my favorite thing about being in class with Katie, and any of our professors who might watch this will attest to this, is usually Katie and I were making like sarcastic comments to one another in class, just quiet enough to cause a disturbance to those around us, but not totally interrupt class.
Because we're respectful enough.
Yeah, but then when we would be asked to elaborate, year 1 we weren't as good, and then by about year 3, when a professor would be like, "Say more," we'd be like, "Fine, let me." So, yeah, every single class. I mean, I think there was maybe 4 classes we didn't have together over 3 years, which is crazy. But
this is like Keri Lynn offices in the barn. She's protecting everybody. We just put her out in the barn.
The whole like sit 6 feet apart in staff meeting. Actually, Zoom staff meetings are killing me because you can't make your like fun, sarcastic side comments on Zoom because nobody hears it because it mutes if two people are talking at once. So
So the
Katie, I
private
missed
chat
you.
for.
I think my favorite thing about sitting by Keri Lynn, and I can say this now because they've already given us our degrees and they can't take them back, is, if you've been to seminary, David, sometimes a class can get a little bit dry, and sometimes the pieces for classes are not as strong as others, and so we had certain classes where we would play bingo. And we would have different squares that represent, like, if we knew the professor was going to say something a lot, we'd give it a number. Or if we knew one of our classmates was going to speak up, we'd give them a bingo square. And so we would make it through those classes by crossing off our bingo boards.
We learned a lot.
Pastors. That's amazing what they let happen.
This is good. This is really fun and embarrassing.
I really feel like every layperson needs to go sit through a week of seminary. With the experience of like seminarian life as well, just to get a better sense of who their pastors really are.
Yeah.
Or not. We can just
or
let
not.
It be a mystery.
Keep it hidden.
But yeah, Katie's going to be our special guest tonight. So the embarrassing stories of my life from seminary, I'm sure, do not stop. It'll be fabulous. Yeah, this will be great. No, but really, thank you, Katie, for being here, and for everybody tuning in. We appreciate you all watching and welcoming Katie as you do. And yeah, did anybody have anything they want to add before I get started?
No, Katie, I actually think, I don't know if you followed Marissa or not at Alexandria.
I followed
Did you?
two after her. So it was Marissa and then somebody else and then me. But I know Marissa really well.
We're in a leadership cohort together that meets, I guess we meet twice a year now, but we used to meet 4 times a year, and she's fantastic. So.
Oh, yeah, I adore her. Yeah.
And this is why it's good to be United Methodist, everybody. It's all connected.
Absolutely.
Cool.
It's the biggest, smallest world in the world.
Yeah.
It totally is. So we are going through the Gospel of Mark. So if you're joining us for the first time, I think what's really cool and unique about going through one gospel at a time is you get to see how each author has their take on the birth, life, death, resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so, Katie, we've kind of talked a little bit about jerky Jesus in Mark, or direct communicator Jesus, if you want to be proper. We talked about Mark's short writing style. Everything that's in Mark is important. A lot of the times we ask ourselves, why is Mark including this in the narrative? And up to this point, we haven't gotten, I know our favorite pastime in seminary was making fun of the disciples. We haven't gotten a lot of great material from them yet.
Right.
Yeah, so we're kind of getting to that point where they're starting to understand who Jesus is, and we're going to see what they do with that information. So, yeah, David, am I forgetting anything review-wise?
No, I think that's pretty much everything. I mean, so I think one of the things that's going to come up this week that we may want to review is there's kind of a mixed bag of audience that we've talked about. It was interesting, we've talked about everybody had Jewish presuppositions of things, but also I think Edgar mentioned, Mark is written for a mostly Greek audience as well. And so there's kind of a mixed bag of who you have to think about is hearing Mark. And I think another, kind of the reiteration of what we always say about these books is as you're looking at them and reading them, you have to remember that the first people that read them weren't us. They were written for a time and a place, and through the work of the Holy Spirit have become relevant because generally all people across history have very similar problems to deal with. So,
yeah. Katie, do you want to add anything, just your personal overview of Mark or anything to add to that?
I think y'all covered it really well.
Great. Okay, well, we are going to be in chapter 5 tonight. Oh, what?
Nothing. She said y'all covered it really well, and I said thanks for coming on, Katie. I was just thinking of
So, Katie, one thing to understand, the same humor that you and I have, David Lessner does share. So
good.
Yep, it's totally fine.
I promise to keep sarcastic remarks to a minimum.
I can't make that promise.
Yeah.
This is good. This is a weird combining of my worlds. All right. We're going to be in Mark chapter 5. So just a review of 4. All of chapter 4 was like one day. It was one very exhausting day that ended with Jesus calming the storm. And this is continuing from that story. So like, I think sometimes we read stories in the Gospels, it feels like so many of the events are separated. But remembering some of that continuity that's coming. So this is what's happening right after Jesus has literally just calmed a storm, and the disciples are kind of questioning, who is this? Like even the wind and the sea obey him. And this chapter is really unique because there's only really 3 things that happen. And so we're going to break it up in a way that I hope will be interesting. And just our usual discussing the Bible and shenanigans. So if you have your Bibles, we're in Mark chapter 5. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. If you've got a different version at home and it phrases something interesting, feel free to put that in the comments. If anybody has questions or other things they want to say along the way, feel free to put that in there, and we can always respond and whatever else anybody needs. So this is Mark chapter 5. We're going to start with verses 1 through 13. So it says, they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of, and I don't even know how to say this country, so it's just for sure. They didn't teach me that in seminary.
They didn't teach me either. You just say it confidently, and everybody's like, "Oh yeah, okay."
I still haven't picked that up well. So verse 2 says, and when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains had wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send him out of the country. Now there on the hillside, a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. So this is...
Tell your kids before bedtime again.
Yes! Okay. Katie, we have this hilarious theme with a lot of our parents who hop on and watch right before they put their kids to bed, that we always end up telling terrible bedtime Bible stories. So this was a great start. This is, I would argue, the strangest healing narrative, at least thus far, in the Gospel of Mark, and if not in all of Jesus's adventures. Because it's just really strange. So just a couple of notes. So this is following the stilling of the storm. So like, it's just a really weird day for the disciples. There's just can you imagine? Like, that's just a lot of strange things happening all at once. Kind of like a global pandemic, just lots of strange all at once. So I think it's really interesting that this person who has these unclean spirits in him, what this says, is there as soon as Jesus gets out of the boat. And to me, that's kind of communicating there's an awareness in this person of what Jesus can do for him. And there's urgency behind wanting to be healed. And I think that's something that will contrast with a story later that we'll kind of see as the movement and the news of Jesus is spreading. So just a couple of Jewish assumptions to talk about. So when it says that a man lives among the tombs, obviously we see that is going to be on the outskirts of town. But with Jewish assumptions, tombs that's where dead people are. Great bedtime story. And that is the ultimate unclean. That's like pinnacle unclean for Jewish people. And so it's kind of this wildly, like, it's where you didn't want to be if you were Jewish, if you're out at the tombs. And so a man lives out there, and he's been shackled and he's been chained. And I actually read this passage from my Bible that I keep at the office, which is a different translation. And one of the things that it said when he talks to Jesus is he says, "Swear to God that you will not torture me." And I think that that is such an interesting thing for him to say. You know, we've seen people ask Jesus to heal them. We've seen people ask Jesus to make them well. This person says, "Swear to God that you won't torture me." And we'll kind of get to that point in just a second. In verse 8, Jesus talks to the unclean spirits that are in him, which is another thing that's a little bit different from the other healings we've seen to this point. And the name legion is really interesting as well. So in kind of a Roman assumption, a Roman legion was about 6,000 soldiers. And it says that the herd of swine were about 2,000. So it's just an interesting, I think we think, oh, this went into like 3 or 4 pigs. No, there was like a ton of them. So the question I have for you all, and if you want to add anything too, feel free. But I want to go back to this "swear to God you won't torture me" line. And I want us to think about what kind of life do we think this man had to live to respond to Jesus in this way?
Go ahead, Katie.
So when I read this, I read it a little differently. I read it from the perspective that it was the unclean spirit coming to Jesus. I had to do a lot of research into demonology because that's not my favorite topic in the church. So the way that I read through this is that it was the demon recognized, the unclean spirit in the man recognized Jesus coming off the boat and knew, like in Jewish history, it's known that the unclean spirits, they would know who Jesus was and they would recognize Jesus, and they knew that Jesus had the power to cast them out and to send them into nothingness. And if their job was to destroy the image of God, and there was the image of God in front of them who could destroy them, then of course they would approach and be, "Do not torment me, do not pull me out of this person, because that means that I have nothing left to do." And so I read it from the perspective of, while it was the man who had the unclean spirit in him, it was the unclean spirit that was responding to Jesus.
What I think is interesting when you mentioned that this is the most weird, fascinating story, like healing story in Mark, is that I read it like almost similarly, but from a different, like I read it from a more socio-political angle of what Mark is dealing with, and that the name is Legion, and that like can't be an accident. So I think from the demon possession standpoint or from the Roman army standpoint, I get this kind of almost the assumption is retributive justice. And so because he's been tormenting the man, or because this Roman army has been tormenting the people, the assumption is what I've done is going to come back to me, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And Jesus is the one who's like, well, no, you've heard that, but I say, like, don't even get mad at your neighbor. And he like lets the demon essentially torment somebody else out of compassion almost. So again, yeah, I didn't see it as the man having this kind of life, but I saw it as the assumption is retribution, and the reaction is grace.
I think something. Sorry, go ahead, David.
No, I was going to affirm what you said, that even if it was just from a demon possession standpoint, I think the demons in Scripture torment people, and so they're assuming that what I do, I'm going to get back, and that's where God is so amazing in grace, I guess, to use him. So sorry, Katie.
No, you're fine. One of my favorite themes in Scripture to like search through is the clean versus unclean. I mean, Keri, Lynn can attest, when we were in Israel, I had so many questions about the Jewish faith and what makes it clean and unclean. And I found it fascinating while reading through this that we know that this spirit possession is unclean, and it's asked to go into something else, like it's asked to be sent into the pigs, which are also considered unclean. And that image of that this unclean spirit didn't have enough power that it had to ask Jesus to be allowed to go into something else that was unclean. Like, it just shows the level of Jesus's power compared to the unclean spirits that was ruling this man's life, and how much more powerful Jesus is.
Yeah, and I think, Katie, that brings up a good point too of even the ways in which Jesus works is for these Jewish assumptions, and yet I would argue like non-Jewish demons are also looking towards Jesus's authority as to where to go and what to do, which again communicates a gospel for all people from the very beginning. Like, it's not something that they just like magically came up with in Acts. It was not brand new in Acts 2 that this message was for all people. It's very consistent from the beginning. So that's a really great point.
And what have we already experienced in Mark a demon possession story where it's the demon who recognizes Jesus as the Son of God first? I don't actually have my Bible with me. I'm on my phone, so I'm a really good pastor who didn't bring his Bible on vacation.
In chapter 1, yes, there is this the man with the unclean spirit, and the spirit says, I think it's the person who says it. Yeah. So it's not, I don't think that we've seen the spirit recognize Jesus first, but we have seen this. But I think this is the first time that the demon in the person has the conversation with Jesus rather than the person, the host. I don't know what we're calling them.
I was just thinking it because so much of Mark is criticizing it's like the parables that come in Matthew as opposed to the wedding guests, of like the people who were supposed to recognize Jesus never recognized Jesus, but all the outsiders and left behinds and everything do. And so to do the juxtaposition later on of the synagogue leader who doesn't act with urgency, as you kind of foreshadowed, versus the demon who is the complete opposite of the synagogue leader who instantly recognizes who Jesus is. Like, there's something about Mark as an evangelistic book. There's another thing about critiquing the society that is, and well, shoot, if the synagogue leaders don't even understand, then we'll go find some people who do, and we'll start the movement with them.
Yeah. So what do you both pastorally or I don't know, just like as general humans, what do you think that this passage, with the way that the man is treated because of what he has, what do you think about what that says about how society treated? There's some argument sometimes that demons can be mental illness or schizophrenia that was undiagnosed or misunderstood. But I think either way, it's still not a reason to chain somebody up in the unclean place. So what do you think that says about how this culture treated things that were not easy to understand?
I think this culture is a very good picture of our own culture, is when there's things in the world that aren't considered normal by those who determine what normal is, by those who have the power, then it automatically becomes this thing that we want to push aside so that we don't have to interact with and we don't have to confront. And I think, myself included, I know in this time where, like with the Black Lives Matter movement, I've had to do a lot of searching in my heart in the places that I have turned a blind eye because it didn't affect me as a white woman. And I think we put on that mindset of, well, I'm not going to worry about that, or I'm not going to focus on that because it doesn't affect me personally. And then when we get into a relationship with somebody who is struggling, or with somebody who is that odd group out that we've pushed out, that's when we begin to really see them as the person they are and not the affliction they have.
Yeah, I would totally echo that and think it's not too long ago in our history. I'm thinking 1960s, in which they literally had insane asylums that weren't focused on mental health. It was just, let's lock up the people who we think are crazy and who are detriment to society, in our view, in our opinion, as opposed to finding the right resources to help. I mean, things as simple as cerebral palsy or Down syndrome. Let's lock them away, as opposed to find meaningful places in society where they can live out the gifts that they still have from God, despite whatever condition they have. So it's not too far away. I think Katie speaks a lot of truth in that. They treat people like we do, and I'm thinking of my own, So I'm up here on vacation, trying to get away from it all for a little while, and we're coming back tomorrow. But I had this wearisome um, thinking about returning. I love ministry. I love my job. I love my church. Love who I work with. I mean, it's really the best situation anybody could ever have. But it was kind of wearisome thinking, okay, when I get back, I have to think about, okay, how does the church become anti-racist?
Yeah.
How does the church work through a global pandemic in which we have to RSVP to come to worship? How does the church work through all these different, I mean, there's just battle after battle after fight after fight after fight. And it's down to the level of what do we do with somebody who doesn't grasp life the same way that we do, whether that be a political mindset or whether it be Down syndrome or whatever. And I just I had this thought of, oh my gosh, this is just too much. And where I would have been somebody who would have just said, you know what, if we can put them in the tombs and chain them up and just forget about them for a little while, that would be a lot more restful for me. But Katie, I think Katie said it really well. You become in a relationship with somebody, and ultimately, when we talk about our relationship with Jesus and entering into that kingdom, it is impossible for us to chain somebody up and put them in a tomb, because we're denying the gift of Christ in that person to us. I'd be curious. I don't know, this is a curious comment, or the question for the comment section is, maybe if we want to be very self-revealing, is who is it that we just want to put to the side, or or maybe not who is it, but what situation would we love? Yeah, because we're gonna have people are gonna start quoting, tagging their in-laws or something. But what situation going on right now would we love to just push to the side, if we were honest? I mean, I'm sure COVID-19 would be the easiest one, but that's a disease instead of a human group.
Well, I think also, when I think about in our society, when we push things to the side, a lot of conversation that I've had is that when we confront something that is different, then we have to confront it with the spirit that maybe we're wrong. And I don't think a lot of people today want to confront an issue with the idea of, well, maybe I'm wrong about my belief. Maybe I'm wrong about what I think. And that's a hard pill to swallow, even for me, to sometimes have to go, Katie, you could be wrong about that. You really need to not think you know everything and humble yourself enough to hear everybody else out.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I was on a couple of calls today regarding our my work with our delegation to General Conference, because that still has to happen, in everything that's going on. We're still going to have a General Conference eventually. And I was really confronted with the United Methodist Church and how we're still not where we need to be in terms of full gender inclusion, full racial inclusion, and now we're trying to make this move for full LGBTQ inclusion. And I want to put it in the tomb because there's also a global pandemic. And today, I've invented a new kind of tired. So instead of turning on my blinker on my steering wheel, I accidentally push the button to go to the next song on the radio. Whole other kind of tired. So I think that's a really interesting sentiment. And I think and maybe this was my original question, but I rephrased it because you guys are brilliant. But I think really we torture that which we do not understand, whether we do so intentionally or not. I think, and I've seen it in my own life. I have tortured that which I do not understand, even if torture is not giving it my full attention. And so maybe some hopeful discussion. So how can we be more aware of our tendency to torture that which we do not understand and stop that? Because it's a cycle, right? That's learned behavior. That's something I think you can see kindergartners torture that which they do not understand. So how would you all say we can stop that cycle and start to recognize it in ourselves sooner?
So I think Katie was brilliant when she pointed out that not many people want to enter into a situation thinking that they might be wrong in that. when you're talking about torture, the first image that came up was the stereotypical. It's the offensive lineman for the football team is torturing the computer science nerd. Um, when in give him 20 years, the computer science nerd will be making $300,000 a year and ruling the world. But for all those computer science nerds out there, it totally gets better. But it the mindset is power, it's athletics, it's popularity, and you just can't understand why somebody wouldn't choose to go that route, even if it was a bigger struggle for that person. And so you torture that person, whether for your own, sometimes it's probably for their own self-aggrandizement, but I think you pick on the person who's the most different than you, as opposed to entering into the relationship of saying, like, you know what, maybe there is something fun about computer science, and trying to understand why that would be just as engaging as football or something else.
Well, I think about, like, growing up, I grew up as a military child. And then when my dad retired, I moved to a little town in Louisiana. And I went to a very conservative, small private college in a little bitty town in Louisiana. And it wasn't until I went to Dallas to seminary, where I sat in class with people who challenged every one of my beliefs, that I began to realize that getting out of my hometown and talking to people who are completely different than I am is the best thing that could have happened for me. Because in that environment, I was forced to see others as people and not as opposite views. And so I think a way that we can recognize this system of torture and the cycle of oppression in whatever way it shows up is to recognize that we've got to learn to see the world through everyone's eyes and not just our own, which comes in intentionally building relationships with those who are different than you are. But not for the sake of convincing them that you're right, but for the sake of just wanting to have conversation and hearing their side out with an honest heart that just wants to hear their point of view with no ulterior motive.
Yeah, I would totally echo, and that may be the way to stop the cycle, or to make the world go in a different direction, if everybody just moved out of their hometown for a little while, or at least so I went to Emory for seminary, primarily to get out of Dallas, because I had grown up in Allen, and I went to TCU for undergrad and wouldn't trade either of those experiences. But then I wanted to enter the ministry, and everyone was like, "Great, Perkins is going to be awesome for you." And Perkins is great, but I just needed to get out of Dodge for a little bit. So going out to Atlanta was just eye-opening. Not only the professors and the education, but the diversity of people, and there were people who had thick Southern roots, Confederate flag waving people that were there, and there were people who had deep Southern roots, but who also were gay. And there were people, like, one of my favorite stories of why Atlanta was such a great choice for me was Candler coordinated a team to enter into an AIDS walk every year. And somehow or another, in being in the leadership council, I got assigned the duty of making T-shirts for this. And I think Keri, Lynn can attest that, like, that is well beyond my capabilities of a human being. So made this T-shirt. It was really simple and bland. We entered into the AIDS walk. Well, the way that, like, the drunk person that designed Atlanta streets, Piedmont runs, like, I can't see my hands on the screen, but, like, Piedmont runs diagonal and Peachtree runs north and south. The AIDS walk started on Piedmont, and then the Pride Parade was going on Peachtree at the same time. And I had no idea that, like, okay, and I had a couple gay friends in high school, but throughout TCU, I didn't really know or think I knew anybody, and it kind of escaped my mind. It was one of those things I left in the tube, and never really thought it was important as to why it mattered that people were making fun of these people and everything. And so, anyway, so I think I'm going to be in this AIDS walk. I'm being a great student council member. And all of a sudden, Piedmont and Peachtree merge, and there is a lot of flamboyance and multicolored things all around me all at once. And it really, I mean, it was like a smack in the face of confronting, okay, this is somebody who I need to walk with for a little while. And it was really a fantastic experience to get me out of my comfort zone of just being able to ignore that for a little bit. So I do think that getting out of your own hometown, I guess as Jesus would say, is got to be a great way of ending that cycle of torturing that which we don't know.
Yeah. Bill, I am going to show your comment so we can see it. So Bill asks, using racism as an example, if you're trying to understand that you have a lot to learn, how do you show sympathy to those who are actively racist or not interested in learning more? So this is a really interesting question. I think a lot of us might find this within our family unit, that creates its own complication sometimes. I think that we have to understand that the love and the grace of Jesus Christ is extended in all directions to those who may go right of the plate of us and those who go left of the plate of us. And I think we forget that a lot. I think we are really into grace when it agrees with us or makes us feel better about what we've done wrong. Yeah. Do either one of you have anything you want to add answering Bill's question, maybe?
No, I really like what you said. I think the best way that I can approach it, and Keri Lynn can attest to this, is I am very, I don't sugarcoat things, which makes being a pastor hard sometimes. It's because when I'm passionate about somebody, I just want somebody to understand. And so obviously my point, like, hello, just understand what I'm trying to say. But I've had to really learn in this past year of being a pastor that I have to approach people in the way that I would want to be approached if I had an idea that was not norm or that made others uncomfortable. Like, I would not take well to somebody yelling and screaming at me and telling me how dumb my belief was. I would completely shut them down and be done. And so I've really had to learn how to respond to people that maybe their view or what they say is really not in line with what I say, and aggravates me and makes me mad, that I have to choose. And it's very hard, and I don't always do it well, but I have to choose to respond in a way that I want to be responded to. And that's been great. And then I have to think about the ways that there's been something so simple that God has wanted me to do, and I have just not been paying attention, and he didn't yell and scream and curse and say, well, forget you, you don't get to be a part of the party. But he continued to walk beside me and continued to hold my hand and continued to be my friend, even when it was really, really hard, I'm sure.
So I think there's a little bit of a model in this Mark passage about the demon who gets cast into the pigs with this. Hopefully we would all agree that somebody who's just an extreme, like an out and out racist who, no one is not apologetic for, would be a demon in our society. The person not so much, but their ideology. And what I see in the way that Jesus handles this is a little bit like the way that we're supposed to discipline our children, but I don't do it very well. Is you take the positive intention of what they're going for, you take the energy that they're going for, and you let them use it in a different way. And so where Jesus takes the demon, and the demon expects to be tortured. As we were talking about earlier, the racist expects to have their job taken. The racist expects for the country to go downhill. The racist expects to be tortured because they, for whatever reason, feel like they're the minority, even though they have power usually. And so Jesus takes the person who expects to be tortured and actually lets the demon do something else that is less harmful. And I'm curious about if that's Jesus's graceful response and how do we take somebody with that passion for something and flip it and turn it to where they're continuing to use that passion, but in that passion experience something that allows them to have their world rocked off the side of a cliff, in a way. Spiritual jujitsu, I guess, is what you're using their weight against themselves, and allowing them to. I think they do need to fall off a cliff on some level, but I think it needs to be a graceful fall that we allow them to feel like they are part of the conversation, or actually not feel, but be a part of their experience using whatever passion that is. I have a heart, I'm sure that I am intrinsically racist on some level. Well, I can tell you examples of where I have been, even though I'm not waving burning crosses around. So I don't totally understand how somebody could wave a burning cross or want to lynch somebody, but or even feel threatened by another person's skin color. But whatever the underlying issue is underneath that, there's got to be a positive way to use that passion. So whether it's for the country or for the community or whatever that is, I think would be a interesting. I don't really have a concrete answer, but I think Jesus does it well in the story, and I think there's got to be some guidance there.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, I'm going to have us moving on through the passage because we could spend all day long on verses 1 through 13. So we're going to do...
And why my brother would cry when the pigs fell off the cliff. Like, I guarantee you, I want you, just as an experiment, when we get back, I want you to read this story to Kyler, and I want you to see what her reaction is when the pigs all die.
I'd rather not.
I mean, just talk about stories to read to your kids before bed.
Oh my goodness. So Katie, Kyler is one of David's daughters, and they're both huge animal lovers. They're cat people. You'd love them.
Yes.
I'm surrounded.
I had to put mine outside
is loving animals.
in the video.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Well, David's cat usually makes an appearance during Bible study, so you could go get your cat if you really wanted to.
The Howard family would be grateful for that.
Yes, they would.
We've had a few weeks without a cat sighting.
I'll get her before we close. I'll go get her.
Okay, we are going to read 14 through 20 before that, though. Okay. So this is back in Mark chapter 5, 14 through 20. The swine herds ran off and told it in the city and the country. The people came to see what it was that happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion, and they were afraid. Those who had seen what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by the demons begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. So what we see with this, again, like what I said from the beginning, is this accelerating action of Mark is starting to take place. Right here in chapter 5, we're already pointing towards this. The movement of Jesus is growing. The news about Jesus is spreading quickly. In verse 17, people ask Jesus to leave the neighborhood. Why do you think they did that? We'll pause right there for a question. Why do you think they did that?
I think the biggest reason they did it is fear. Because standing or sitting before them was this man who they had decided was one way, and Jesus shows up, and now this man had did something that was an example of his incredible power. And if I were those people and I had a perception of this thing, and then I saw this man get off the boat and exude his power so much that this ill man was now well, I can't say I'd be like, "Oh, come on, Jesus, come have family dinner with us." Like, that's gotta be scary.
Yeah, I was just looking up something real fast, and there was a lot of in the Decapolis was a largely kind of Greek area, or a very Hellenized area. I was looking up just to see if Jews lived there still, and they were, but they were very Hellenized. And they were very Greek thinking, and so I think it's a little bit of a threat to them. Which I think in the Jewish culture, obviously the pigs are unclean. If it's a Greek culture, the pigs all of a sudden become not clean, or they become just fine. And if this guy is making 2,000 pigs jump off and the city's food supply is going, then all of a sudden he's a major threat as well.
Yeah. Okay. So this man at the end of the story, who had all of the demon, or one demon, however many we want to think it is, cast out of him, an entire life of torture and of outcast. And he goes to Jesus and he's like, "Let me come with you." And Jesus says no, which is really interesting. Yeah. It's, again, this is not this. There is no world where this is taught in Sunday school, where Jesus tells somebody they can't follow him. Right? We do the cute, like, "Oh, the disciples dropped their nets and immediately," and then the guy who wanted to go gets told no. But he is given a commandment from Jesus. He is told to go and to tell what has happened to you. So given the commandment to go and tell, can we still consider this man by maybe our modern definition a disciple of Jesus, even though he may not have been one of the 12 main men who are named? And in your pastoral, brilliant opinions, what does this mean for the mission of the church today?
So, I mean, I think it totally fits the idea of a disciple of Christ. Which is, I mean, so when I say the word disciple, I mean somebody who kind of undergoes a shift in attitude and action and behavior to model the life of Christ. And we don't know if this guy did or not. He got healed and he went and told all the good news, and so he's evangelists. So, like, if I'm being really semantically nerdy, disciple may not be totally the right word, but I do think that it shows. I think it shows possibilities beyond the local church, I guess, for those people who would never darken the door, who may not be in the club like the 12 were. That there are people who have really great experiences from healing or from somebody who portrays Christ to them, and they're not going to be somebody who goes and darkens the door of a local church, but they may be people who are the best people we have to go and share that there's better news out there than the world has to offer, because of everything that God did for us in Jesus. And so I think, and I'm trying to think of a really good example. Katie probably expound upon this better than I can.
No, I'm a Bible nerd with semantics, always my language. So I definitely see that point of view. I think the biggest takeaway I had from this in the mission of the church is that the mission of the church is not just meant for those called apart by name or those in leadership. And I think sometimes as pastors, I'll speak for myself as a pastor, I have to look at my lady and go, it's not just the pastor's job to make ministry happen. It's not just the pastor's job to proclaim the gospel. Like, you're a part of this mission journey just like I am. God called you to speak in the ways that you're able. And you may not be a preacher. You may not have the gift to stand up in front of people and preach a sermon. But God has called you to the mission in the way that he has prepared you to do your part. And so I think about this man and that God called him to proclaim the good news for the mission in the way that he could by going to speak to his people who knew him, who would have to relearn him a little bit, but he probably had a whole lot more credibility with them than this strange man off the boat.
Yeah, I think that's what I was taking from it was biblical proof that ministry is contextual. Jesus tells this man and I think it's true. It's better for him because this is somebody that Jesus, when Jesus is healing people up to this point, he's told them not to tell anyone. This is one of the few times thus far that Jesus is like, yeah, go tell everybody what just happened and the mercy that God has shown you. Because even in just a few seconds, we're going to see Jesus tell people not to say anything. And so I think about the ways in which ministry is contextual. And I think Katie and I had, even in seminary, we had a lot of discussions about what would work in a Louisiana context is not the same as what worked in a Dallas context or a Texas context, even just the state as a whole. But I think that it is, your point about lay people is really, really brilliant, Katie. I do think this is showing us that, to me, the commandment to go and to tell does indicate a way of becoming a disciple of Jesus, because that's ultimately the commandment that disciples are given. And isn't it, I think it's interesting, the insider-outsider piece we've been talking about, that this guy doesn't spend time with Jesus before being told to go and tell. He has everything he has in the one experience he's had of Jesus. And we're about to see, again, moments where the disciples aren't getting it, and they've had more than just the one experience. Yeah. Any thoughts on that? Yeah.
Well, I think Kathy said similar to what you said. I think is really important is that discipleship can be defined as obedience, and Jesus tells him, go and tell this, and he does. And I think the part about lay people that's important here too is over however many, I'm old now, so 11, 12 years of like commissioned ordained ministry, the thing I hear the most is, I just don't have anything. I don't know how to do this. I don't know what to say. I'm not prepared enough. I'm not educated enough. I'm not spiritual enough. And Matt Miofsky is a guy who he's a pastor up in St. Louis, and said all evangelism is being excited about something and telling other people. Mm-hmm. And this guy does that so really well. Of, this happened to me. Let me go, let me just share what happened to me. And that's all we're really asking people to do. And that's all Jesus is asking people to do, is like, you don't need to know all 28 tenets of the Westminster Confession. Like, you need to, which nobody needs to know the Westminster Confession anyway, but
you don't.
What'd you say?
Not for your MDiv, you don't.
That's right, yeah, not for your MDiv and not for ordination in the United Methodist Church. So I think, because I think the thing about this too is, I was just reading something. I was scrolling through social media and I saw the article and I stopped, and it was one of the reasons why. It was talking about one of the reasons why churches aren't growing is simply because we don't know non-Christians. Like we form little clubs, we get in our Sunday school classes, we love them, it's great, it's discipleship, we're growing, and we're supporting each other really, really well, and those are wonderful. But the downside of those really close-knit small groups is that they become so close-knit that they forget anybody else in the world.
Yep.
And when our primary commandment from Jesus, besides love one another, is go and make disciples, you have to know some people who aren't disciples. And so the best people, like, I remember there was a guy who was a firefighter one time who had this kind of really mystical experience and showed up on our church doorstep. And we had some great conversations, and ultimately I ended up baptizing him and his family. And it was this kind of really cool experience. Well, guess who the number one inviter of people was after this? Like, we had people at this church for 18 years who had not invited one person. And all of a sudden, this dude named Jared shows up. He, after 6 weeks or so, gets baptized. And he invites like 30 people in the next month to come to church and check it out because of what he was, what he was excited about. So I think that part of the reason why he's told to tell people is because, like, the disciples already know the same old people. I think this guy knows a whole new crop of people.
Yeah.
This is one of those Bible stories where I wish, it's like the part 2 of a movie, I wish we could have gotten the picture of when he went back into the town and the reaction of those who had ostracized him and who had chained him up. Like, this is where, for my self-enjoyment, I want to see the next part of the story.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
okay.
Novel you can write one day.
I'll leave that to Keri, Lynn. I'm more of a math person.
Okay, we are going to move on because we need to. We're going to run out of time before we get to the really good stuff. So we are going to read 21 through 34. So it says, when Jesus had crossed again, this is crossing the Sea of Galilee, crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus, I don't really
say it with confidence.
Hadn't figured that out still. Came to him. When he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be well and live. So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much pain under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and come up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, if I but touch his clothes, I will be made well. Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say who touched me? That's very sassy disciples for you. There's a lot of people. What do you mean who touched me? Verse 32 says, he looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. So again, the author of the Gospel of Mark does not include a lot of details. So the details that are included are always important. That's one thing always to remember with Mark. With Matthew and John, they're very wordy. The details are less essential. So here you're seeing, again, the large crowd is something that's being described in detail throughout a lot of chapter 5, these opening passages about movements growing, large crowds, people being there as soon as he gets out of the boat. So you've got Jairus, I still don't know. This synagogue leader dude who wants his daughter to be healed. And so what he does is he goes and he talks to Jesus. And then, and his story is sandwiched. We're going to get to the end of that story in a second. So in the middle of this is this bleeding woman who is not named. And she's been hemorrhaging, it says, for 12 years. And she has spent money on getting doctors to heal her. And it still hasn't happened. In fact, she's worse. And so she's suffering physically. She's suffering economically, and I would think also psychologically. So again, Jewish assumptions. Again, sorry if any kids are watching, but when a woman is on her period, she's not allowed to she can't sit in a seat that her husband's going to sit in. And there's a cleansing period for 7 days after your period. So like 2 weeks out of the month, women were just hanging out doing nothing, I guess. But blood was very, very unclean because it tended towards death. And so if a woman had been hemorrhaging for 12 years, it doesn't tell us about how she may have been treated. But with Jewish assumptions, we can assume it probably wasn't great. And so she hears about Jesus and she says, if I can just touch his clothes, then I will be healed. So she knows something about Jesus, whether from hearing it or maybe even something in her spirit told her that. And so she touches Jesus's cloak and she's healed immediately. And I think what's interesting is another detail that's included here is she feels it herself. She says she immediately felt it in her body that she was healed. And the thing that Jesus says to her in verse 34 is that it is her faith who has made her well. And I think it's one of the things I read in a commentary was the fear in Jewish culture of blood and impurity is that it would have been contagious. But in this, what we see is contagious is the healing power of Jesus. That's the thing that's spreading. So it flips this narrative on its head that's this Jewish assumption about blood and about impurity. So why do you think Jesus says to the woman, your faith has healed you of all things and in this passage? And what do you think that it meant to this woman for her to hear that?
So when I think about this phrase, as somebody who, like, I know Keri Lynn has mentioned before on here, I have a chronic genetic condition. And so I have sat in sermons in my past where people have said, well, if you were just more faithful, you would be fine. You would be healed. And so this is one of those verses in scripture that is hard to read sometimes if we read it in the context of one mindset. And so I think about this woman, part of, my love of unclean and clean and how that all sorts out is this woman would not have been allowed to go to synagogue. She would not have been allowed to attend religious services and for 12 years. And still 12 years later, she saw Jesus walking and still had the faith, even though she had not had any religious services. She hadn't had anybody speak life into her. She hadn't had any relationship with anybody for 12 years. She still thought and she still knew that God was faithful. And if she just reached out and touched the hem of his garment, that her life could change. Things could be different. And so I think about, this woman who was probably so desperate for just any form of interaction with anybody, because nobody would have talked to her, nobody would have looked at her. She would have just been this object on the corner, that when he looked at her, when he looked in her eyes, and when he spoke directly to her, that was more of the point than exactly the words he said. Like, he was bringing that relationship back into her life that had been missing for 12 years, while recognizing that, even though she faced these unimaginable things for 12 years, she never lost sight of what God could do in her life.
Yeah, I'm glad you answered first because I didn't know you had a chronic condition, and I always, and I would like, I struggle with this because, like, I would say that I've seen one situation where I was in an ICU and I was praying with a family, and they said this woman's going to die, and we prayed, and then the next day I find out she's being released from the ICU and she's fine. Um, Most of the time when I'm in a situation like that, it's not that story, right? And miracles are miracles by definition; they're rare. So, like, I think when we do read this story, we generally think of, okay, there was some sort of Benny Hinn style faith healing that happened. I don't know how, if he hit her with the jacket or whatever, but we always go to that assumption, and I don't always know what to say in this because I know so many people who have been heartbroken waiting on that miracle. Like, they're waiting on that situation, whether it's a debilitating back injury or, whatever. So I have a hard time with this, but I do agree. I think I also think it speaks to just how different Jesus is compared to the rest of what this woman has been living in the midst of. And kind of maybe the empty ritual of the religious service that she wasn't able to go to, or the empty life of people who just left her on the street corner. And like you said, I think the best, like what I resonate with, what you said, I'm glad you said it, was he looked in her face and saw her, because she was brave enough and believed enough to go grab his cloak. And when I think about the story of the Good Samaritan and other ones, they would have just scoffed at her and thrown her to the side again. And Jesus looks at her and values her, and he only does that because she believes so strongly to make the move. And I think that she, like, we can talk about prevenient grace and the fact that she heard of Jesus beforehand and she knew there was something up there, but there was ultimately some form of assurance that she needed in grasping for Jesus. And this is where I think when people are skeptical about the healing power of Jesus in their own spiritual self or their own soul, this is a story I like to tell and point them to, of the instantaneous reversal. And I've been fortunate enough to be with people who are alcoholics. And it's kind of let me rest in just, if I can only just grab a string of the fabric, that'll give me enough strength to put the bottle down, right? And it is enough strength for many of them. So I think, I don't know how to answer necessarily in terms of the actual physical healing that happens with her, but I do know that faith being a worldview and a mindset can completely be so powerful enough to reverse circumstances in our lives that are debilitating. Unfortunately, it's not often like chronic back illness or something, but other things. I think this speaks to just the power that Jesus has in our lives.
I think another thing, as somebody that has a chronic illness, that I've had to, because this is any scripture that says, have faith, you're healed. It's difficult to swallow when you're in that person's shoes. And like my condition, there's no cure yet. And so the way that I have really had to explore this scripture and wrap my mind around it is the fact that healing can come in more than one way. And so, we talk about the reversal. Well, I think about in death, we say in death there's healing, and that person's condition has been reversed in the next life, in eternal life. And so often, one of my favorite things about being a pastor and being a Bible nerd is to see the ways that our English language has failed the translation and has failed to completely communicate the translation. And I think this is one of the ways where we see healing as, I was sick and now I'm well, or I had this problem and Jesus took it away, and this one way that I picture healing. And when we change our minds to say, well, healing can occur in many different ways, and everybody's life is different, then we can affirm that your faith heals you, but maybe it's not in the way that you were expecting healing. So I don't mind sharing a personal story. When I was younger, I found out that my condition was genetic. And so at 18, I made the decision that I was not going to have biological children. And that was really difficult because the only dream I ever had in life was to be a mom and to have 6 children and to get to tell my parents I was pregnant and get to do a gender reveal and all of that. Like, that was my biggest dream in life. And so having to realize that that wasn't going to happen for me at 18 years old was really, really difficult. And then this past summer, last summer, I had a surgery done because I had some other sicknesses, and it left me unable to have any children. And so I had to revisit those feelings of being 25 or being 18 and realizing that motherhood would never come the way I expected it to. And for years, I would pray, God, just make me better. Why do I have to have NF? Why do I have to be born this way? Like, I don't understand this. What did I do wrong to have this? And it was when I was 25, and I look back at 18-year-old me who didn't fully understand. And I began to evaluate the ways in which my heart had changed. And so no longer did I really crave getting pregnant or being able to tell my parents I was pregnant. But I began to feel the joy of looking at a child who needed a home and being able to provide that for them. And looking into the ways of adoption where I got to tell my kids, go knock on the door and tell grandma and grandpa they're your grandma and grandpa. And so I got to experience the healing of my heart in a way that I wasn't expecting. I wanted a cure. I wanted to be able to have babies. And instead, God changed my desires that I didn't crave that anymore. But I saw other avenues in which people needed a mom and I could be a mom.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
So it's interesting, peek behind the curtain. We schedule our guests based on their availability, really. And they're in this situation with Katie and with a couple others coming up. It's fascinating. I knew as soon as I put you down on this day with this situation that, just knowing you and knowing your story, that it would be something that you might share and talk about. And obviously, like, just being part of your life the last 3 years has been, you've taught me so much about what it means to relook. Because as soon as I read a passage like this, I think about you and I think about the ways in which you shared, like, this is cool, but it's not helpful when taken, just pray some more and you'll be better. And so I think that again, when I saw that you were going to be on this week with this passage, I was like, oh my gosh, because I think, Katie, you bring such a good witness to what it means to look at healing. I think we look at it from a very Western context, in which we understand healing to be a very medical and almost scientific term, of I have this and I'm healed, so now I do not.
It's a very physical, body-minded healing.
Yeah.
Right. And I think
we separate the spiritual and the physical, unlike the Hebrews did when it was all very connected.
Yeah. And I think interjecting some of that Eastern thought that is the context of our Bible, and the stories that are in it, where it's a little bit more of a holistic look of the body, mind, and soul in one place. I think it's fascinating. This woman was not just suffering physically from her bleeding. And that's when we read it with American eyes, we think, oh man, she was bleeding for 12 years. That sounds awful. But when we come to understand that she's literally completely pushed out, she's probably out in the tombs with the man with the demon as well, right? And she economically is suffering. And for those to be the things that are relieved, it's the whole person that is healed. It's not just the disease in this moment. And so in your experience, I think hearing about how, no, the disease is not healed, but you as a person and this idea and this calling that you have is what is adjusted and what is healed and what has had so much grace interjected into it in a way that we could have never ever expected in a million years.
I think I'm probably saying the exact same thing that you are, but I'll mansplain. No. I really, like, all I was going to say is I think that healing in this context is invitation back into the life of the community. Yeah. Kind of like the guy who was in the tombs, like you mentioned, when you were unclean as a Hebrew person, like, you just literally couldn't do anything. Like, you were an outcast, and to be seen and heard, and I do think that is. I've mentioned this before, at least to Keri, Lynn, and our staff, but I'm always amazed at the people who come to my office who have just spiritual conundrums, and some of those stem from physical illnesses, and some of those stem from relationship issues and other things. And every single person, except for maybe three, will say, I'm the only one who's going through this. Like, I feel like I'm the only one. And it really hit home that people say that so often. When a woman came in several months ago and just said, I'm going through a divorce and I can use the church's help. And I said, oh my gosh, I wish we would have known beforehand. We hopefully could have helped out. She said, no, it probably wouldn't help out, but I didn't want to come because I just feel like I'm the only one who's going through this. And I didn't want to be embarrassed. I was like, the divorce rate is like just shy of 50% in America. So I don't know how she felt like she could be the only one going through this. But when a crisis happens, or when we have a condition or something, it tends to alienate us. Or we feel alienated, or we get alienated. And I just love what you said, Katie, early on about like Jesus actually turns and looks at her. And that can be the most powerful.
I think that's the biggest thing about this, is that her bleeding or our physical illnesses are like the least of the problems. It's the things that come because of that. The feeling like I'm alone. I'm the only one going through this. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, well, I joined the church and I met some great people and I started to, I was still sick or I was still experiencing this, but my life changed. It's when we do invite them back into relationship, that's where the healing begins to occur. That's where God begins to work. And that's where we get to participate in God's work in their lives. And when we only focus on healing as a physical body, we miss the incredible power that God has in our whole life. He doesn't just care about our physical body. He cares about us as an entirety, as his perfect creation. That's my. I could talk about this all night. So.
I know you could.
No,
it just makes me so happy. Go ahead.
Oh, so I would say one of our seminary class was it was in systematic theology, and the smartest man in the world taught our systematic theology class. And I say that because you could give him a Bible passage, and he could recite it from memory in 4 different languages. And then you could ask him who led the Cubs in RBIs in 1987, and he'd be able to tell you that person too. So we were having a discussion about resurrection and the bodily resurrection. And we started having the conversation of, okay, when resurrection happens, what happens if somebody lost their leg in a tractor combine incident? Do they come back with both legs, and then it turned into, okay, what about people with Down syndrome? Do they come back without Down syndrome, or do they have Down syndrome because God is able to bless them in that way? And ultimately, he was trying to lead the conversation us to a point of saying, like, a lot of us lean in some way toward kind of a prosperity gospel, because if everything's going well, we feel blessed, as opposed to looking at, like, there's an ordained minister in the North Texas Conference who is a paraplegic, who's in a wheelchair full time, and he does fantastic ministry.
He was at Preston, wasn't he? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Justin Hancock is his name, and he does fantastic ministry. And so to look at him and say, well, he's not useful to God because he's in a wheelchair full time, it just seems blasphemous. But when we read this story, we instantly think of am I healthy, wealthy, and wise? If so, especially the first two, who cares about wisdom these days? But if I'm healthy and wealthy, then God's blessed me.
And we determine what is normal health and what is normal wealth based on what is normal in our context.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I got to move us on. Sorry.
That's your job today.
So I had a question, but I'm going to put a pin in it, and I want us to read the rest of this passage because I think it just is really interesting the way the author or authors of the Gospel of Mark decide how to write and sandwich these stories together. So just keep that in mind as we're reading this next section. So this is the rest of chapter 5. So this is 35 through 43. While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead." And this is to the synagogue dude's daughter.
Jairus.
Jairus. Sorry. They should have never given me an MDiv. This is what we're learning, is I'm just the dumbest one in my group of people I know. Okay.
No one can pronounce these right.
Okay, anyways, they come. So while he's still speaking, the people come from the leader's house to say, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. Jerky Jesus right here. Like, I'm just going to continue with my hypothesis here. And they laughed at him, which is also not kind. They laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her some other word that none of us can pronounce, which means, little girl, get up. And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. And they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. So, a couple of just points in this. I think it's really interesting what Jesus responds in verse 36 when the people have come and they've said, your daughter is dead. Why bother Jesus anymore? There's no point. She's gone. But Jesus says, do not be afraid. Just keep trusting. This is the first time in the Gospel of Mark that we see Peter, James, and John to be, they're the three favorites, right? And this is the first time they get to go do a special thing. And I think in a couple weeks, we get to see them do more special things. They get to see the coolest stuff. Like, let's be honest. The crying and wailing that's happening when Jesus arrives is a common mourning practice of this culture. And Katie can attest to our friends Tindress and Anita. I have been to funerals with them, and the tradition of kind of the African crying and wailing is something, and maybe Katie, you've seen something similar even in just Louisiana. It's a really fascinating mourning practice. And so Jesus is coming up, and these people have already entered into the mourning practice. They have given up. They have decided that this girl is gone. And he says to them, why are you being so loud? She's sleeping. Which is just, it's, again, Jesus, like, what are you doing? But he tells her to get up. She gets up. And then we have another instance where he tells people, and remember, he sent all of the mourners away. It was just the mother, the father, and the three favorites. They get to see what's happening here. And at the very end, he tells them, don't tell anyone, which was a pattern of the healings that Jesus performed in the earlier parts of the Gospel of Mark. So, in your opinion, after this, the man with the demons being told to go and tell, but now these people being told do not go and tell, why do you think Jesus is reverting back to this pattern of telling people who are healed not to say anything?
So the only thing I can make of it is, I think Jesus is more calculated than people give him credit for in terms of where he's moving and his in-game and all of that. And it being a synagogue leader, there's a better chance that he's going to be accused of blasphemy and all the things that he ends up getting accused for. So I think in the Decapolis region where, it doesn't seem like Judaism is that as big of a thing, there's people's heart. I mean, there's just lives to be transformed there versus a more kind of thicker audience, I suppose, of the synagogue leaders who probably already have it out for Jesus. I think by, I don't know if it's John or Luke or what. Actually, is it Mark? I can't. Do we already read that where it's like in chapter 1 or 2 they're plotting on how to kill Jesus already? Maybe it's not Mark. It's pretty early on in one of them. Maybe for chapter 2. It's not important, but in one of the Gospels, they're like planning on killing him very early on, and it doesn't come to fruition for a while. So that's the only thing I can make of it is like you said, ministry is contextual.
I don't have a better answer. That's one of those things where, like, I have a list of Jesus questions of things that don't affect my relationship with Jesus, but I still want to know the answer to. Like, give me the other part of the story. That I have a list when I get up there, I'm sure, in all of my spare time. And when I'm not amazed that I'm standing for my Savior, I can go, okay, I need to answer some things. And this is one of them.
Pull out a list. That's
But
funny.
I think my favorite part of this passage is the contrast that this woman was unclean, had no contact, had no religious anything for 12 years, and her faith was so strong. And his daughter had been dead for 2 minutes, and everybody was like, "Oh, just leave the teacher alone." Like, such a contrast in faith of 12 years to 2 minutes, and he was like, "She's just sleeping." Like, that is jerky Jesus a little bit, but I think we've all been there, where we've been like, "Guys."
There's some bipolar too, that they go from wailing and mourning to laughing like in an instant.
I'm fascinated by that. Yeah.
And like the doubt, and that to laugh at somebody when they tell you something, it's like a slap in the face of, okay, yeah, sure. And like, this woman had every reason to not believe Jesus could do what he could do, because she spent 12 years alone with these people who believed in the religious life, who held to the religious life, treating her like nothing. And this religious leader, his daughter was gone for 2 minutes, and everybody around him who surely knew the synagogue leader, who had surely seen his practice of faith, had no understanding or recollection that Jesus could do incredible things.
Yeah. That's one thing that we talked a little bit about last week that I think is a very consistent theme in Mark, is it flips the concept of insiders and outsiders that was a Jewish assumption on the head. It's the outsiders that understand better than the insiders every single time. The woman who's hemorrhaging for 12 years, who literally was an outsider. We know she hadn't gone the door of a synagogue in at least 12 years. She was the one who had the most incredible faith. And here we've got the synagogue leader. So like, think SPRC chair, pastor, board of trustee, head of trustees, this person with what we can probably assume is a house full of mostly religious people. Like, I think that's a pretty fair assumption to say that most of the mourners would be religious. The insiders, according to culture, don't get it.
What is so like bookends, like script, people who wrote the biblical texts are so incredible in this, is that this demon, an unclean spirit inside of somebody, recognized Jesus and his power to the point where he's like, "Don't torment me, don't cast me out. If you're going to cast me out, cast me into something else living." This thing that is wholly against God recognizes the power of God in Jesus, and this religious leader doesn't.
Right. Well, and it's the religious leader who has to be told to have faith, which is even more interesting, because it's that very faith that the religious leader is instructed to have that heals the woman.
Right.
I think it's all fascinating. David, anything to add?
No, not to that. One of the things that keeps sticking out at me is when I've read this a couple times today, is the woman was bleeding for 12 years, and the woman was 12 years, or the little girl was 12 years old. And I just know the numbers are important in Scripture, so I don't know if there's just supposed to be the tie between those two experiences. Is it just a literary device to make the tie between the person who shouldn't have had any faith and the people who should? Or since 12 is kind of a number of completion, is this Jesus showing some sort of completeness of the kingdom, and that will heal a woman's soul and body as well as bring a woman back to life, and then forecasting of resurrection, or what? I have no real good answer for that, but it just seems to be more than a coincidence that the numbers are the same.
Yeah.
I don't know this to be true. I have no scholarly backup for this, but you saying that makes me think about maybe that little girl experienced 12 years of abundant life, and this woman experienced 12 years of nothing that could even be called life. Mm-hmm. In the contrast of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and interesting too, we don't get a look into, again, like, I just wish I wondered, like, what kind of life did this girl live after literally, like, being I mean, in her perception, woken up from a nap from Jesus, but resurrected from the dead by Jesus. You know, we don't get the second half of either woman's story. And it's also just really tragic that they're the ones that aren't named in this passage. Like, everybody gets a name in here except these women. Yeah, I wish I had part 2 of both of these stories.
I do think it's interesting, for all we've talked about Mark being this gospel, like the gospel of immediacy. This whole section is slow.
Yeah.
Jesus kind of takes his time, and then it's not that he seeks out the woman seeks out him, and then he just kind of takes some more time getting to the daughter, and then, you know, she's dead for a couple, you know, however long, and takes his time there. And so I think it's kind of this introduction to the idea of belief and faith is in the immediacy of the coming kingdom. There's still some sense of it's okay to, like, sometimes faith means waiting. Like, sometimes having a strong faith, or sometimes the strongest faith can outlast some of the biggest doubt, I guess, including your daughter being dead.
So I have one more question I want us to use our last 4 minutes with. So I think what's interesting with this story is the girl who is dead, or believed to be dead, is given up on by everyone in her house and everyone who came to her house. But Jesus resurrected her, or even resurrected the idea, right? He doesn't even confirm that she died. He says she's just sleeping. So in your either pastoral career thus far, or just in your own spiritual journey, what is something that maybe that you gave up on and called dead, that maybe was just sleeping, that Jesus or God or Holy Spirit, whichever one you like, resurrected back to life for you?
I think mine would start when I first got called to ministry. When I first got called, I knew that God was calling me to be a pastor. But I went to a religious college that told me every day that that was not a job for a woman, that was not something a woman was able to do. And so as bold as I am, and as much as I really don't take much off of anyone, hearing every day that this dream you have is not possible and you can't do it begins to affect you. And so for many years, I decided that I was going to be a youth director or a children's director because I could do that. And that was the only amount of belief I had in myself. And it wasn't until I went to Perkins for a visit that I just so happened to go the same day that my bishop was speaking in chapel. And she was like, well, of course you can do it, Katie. I believe in you, so why wouldn't you be able to? And I went to that visitation at Perkins so that I could tell my family and my pastors at home to leave me alone about being a pastor, that I couldn't do it, that it wasn't for me. And I came out with the spirit of, well, maybe I can. Maybe, you know, all this doubt I had was not mine. It was something somebody else put in my life, and I believed it, and that fear completely killed a dream and a calling that I knew was there from the beginning. And then here we are.
We're glad. I was saying, we're glad that dream didn't die. So, and my battery may die while I'm telling the story. We'll see. But like, I guess pastorally, it happens all the time. I even think of, in this time of COVID, one person very directly has said, I had stopped coming to church. I'd kind of given up on it. But now that I have nothing to, basically I have nothing to do and it's online and it's just there, easy to access, they've engaged again. And this person has really felt, even just, it's kind of like her reaching for the hem of Jesus' cloak again. Mm-hmm. And finding how powerful it is to just know that God is still there for her, or with her, in the midst of her life when she thought that her faith was kind of slipping. So, pastorally, this happens all the time. It's just, I get really humbled by God's persistent love, by watching myself and church members over and over and over again who are radically on fire, slip away, come back, get bored, come back, have a detrimental experience, come back, and God is consistently still there. It just faith never dies. I think personally, I was thinking when I read the question earlier, I was thinking of relationships. Like, for example, just some of the guys I was real good friends with in high school, and then we got into college and we were just away from each other. And you thought, you know what? It's just natural circumstances. We're moving away from our high school friends. And then all of a sudden you get a text message and it strikes up. And it's just one of those things that keeps on. But I think since Katie shared a story, I'll share a personal story of when Lindsay and I graduated from college. There was every reason in the world and every obstacle in the world to why we shouldn't end up together. When she went off to Europe, I went off to seminary. There was just multiple different things, and there were several different times, and I thought, this is just dead, and I need to move on. And there was kind of this constant nagging her. Every time I would start thinking that, she would call from Germany or Greece or wherever she was at to say hi. And so it was kind of these remarkable occurrences of then she came back, we reconnected, and ended up getting married, and recognized that it was just kind of dormant for a little while. And I fully credit the persistent faith of the Holy Spirit guiding us through all of that to end up, I would say happily ever after, or at least happy. So we'll see. I bought her ice. I went and got her favorite ice cream from the store when she was tired today. So I feel like that's a win.
I think I speak for all of us when I say, like, you're cool, but Lindsay's way cooler, and we're glad that y'all ended up together because we know Lindsay.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. No, I'm worth very little in the church or life in general compared to her.
Oh man, yeah. No, I think just because we're all getting personal today, I think for me, I've really felt just like my own personal resilience this year. I keep waiting for a day that I can't get out of bed, and it hasn't happened yet. I've been able to every day, even if it's not till noon, swing my feet around and put them on the floor and at least accomplish something that day. And I think I've been really amazed at the way that God has worked through people and through work and through even if it's just a good movie on Netflix or whatever, to continue to help me find resilience. And I think that's what you both have shared, is the ways in which the things that we think are dead are actually the things that remind us to be resilient and continue to push forward. So I hope for everybody watching, this is perhaps some encouragement as we're in the middle of a very long pandemic and a very long season of today is that we are over halfway through with 2020 as of today. So there's some maybe good news.
It can only get better, y'all.
Let's not say that. But you know what? At some point, if the thing that you can say about what God has done in your life is that somebody called you and said hello, or that you swung your feet over and you got out of bed and that's what you accomplished, I hope that that's you can see God moving in that. It's not always these great healing moments that maybe we see, but it's more in the moments where our spirit is healed a little bit. So it is time and a little over. So Katie, I love you. You're just the best.
Thanks for having me. This was so much fun.
Yeah, we're glad you were coming on. You came on with us. This is awesome.
Yeah. This really was.
You just pencil me in.
Yeah. Next plan and world takeover here. Everybody watching, a couple of things for the next couple of days. If you are one of my Open Door volunteers, we have our summer drive-by tomorrow at 6:30. I've heard from a lot of guests that are really excited about coming. Please remember, we're going to have to maintain really strict social distancing, including masks. So that's at 6:30 tomorrow at the church parking lot. If you have never volunteered with Open Door, you're more than welcome to come hang out and wave to our lovely, lovely guests. And then Sunday, we are back to 2 services. So that'll be a nice thing to get back to. We'll be strictly online still. And Sean McCafferty is going to be guest preaching for us, so David and I both can get a break at the same time. And he's going to be preaching about the musical Hamilton. So Sean McCafferty is not throwing away his shot. He's going to be in the room where it happens. He's past patiently waiting, smashing every expectation.
Fun fact: Sean was posting, like live posting about Hamilton when they won all their Tony Awards. and I gave him a very masculine, make fun of, like, you should not be this excited about Tony Award kind of comment. And he instantly like texted me and said, like, you've got to check this out. This is amazing. Which is funny that I even made the comment because I love Broadway musicals. But so we went out to breakfast that like 2 mornings after or something, and he introduced me to Hamilton. Like, I got the book, and I've been a complete geek. That's the reason why he's preaching the Hamilton series, is because he introduced me to it, and it just, like, he deserves to preach this time.
Yeah, he is going to be great. So that'll be at 8:30 for traditional and 11 o'clock for contemporary on our Facebook Live page. So don't forget about that. And we'll be right back here next week. I don't remember who our guest is, but it's somebody that David knows. So maybe. I don't actually remember.
It is. I think it may be David Horton down from Houston.
Two Davids.
Well, it's either David Magianos or David Horton, because we've got this whole run where it's we've got a couple weeks straight where it's somebody else named David, and so Keri Lynn is going to be surrounded by all of God's beloved people.
This never happens to you. You never get two Keri Lynns.
You know, you are just more unique and special than all of us.
Look, there's 3 Rev Katie's in my district, so.
Gosh.
Oh.
That sounds terrible. All right. Well, Katie, thank you so much. David, thank you for tuning in on vacation. My face is red because my worlds are coming together, and this couldn't have gone better. So yeah. All right, everybody. We will see you all Sunday, tomorrow, next Wednesday, somehow, eventually. Okay, bye.
Bye, y'all.